I'm Cindy Kelly, president of the Atomic Heritage Foundation, and we are in Rockville, Maryland, and the date is Wednesday, October 1st, 2014. And I have the privilege of interviewing Rosemary Lane. And the first question is to ask, please tell me your name and spell it.
Spell it? Well, Rosemary Lane. And Rosemary, Rosemary, one word. Myers, my maiden name, Maiers, and then Lane, Lane.
Perfect.
Good.
That's very helpful for the record. Now, if you could start by telling us your birthday and something about where you were born and your childhood.
My birth date is September 8th, 1921. I was born in a small town in Iowa, Holy Cross, Iowa. 300 people. Still has about, well, I think they've added about 25 or so more, but it's still a small town. Went to the school, that little Catholic school in that community, and actually left that area when I was 18 years old and went to Chicago to go to nursing school. But my first 18 years were spent just having a wonderful childhood, I felt, in this little town. I was the oldest of 4 children. My father was an implement and hardware dealer in the town, the little village, actually. And had lots of, actually, most of the people that lived there were relatives. A lot of them were. It was a community of primarily German and Irish heritage people. And I actually didn't really even know people, hadn't met anyone who was colored or seen anybody who was colored or any other denominations except for those two for all the years I grew up. Although I didn't think I had a deprived childhood by today's standards. I guess I didn't have much exposure to. I was very limited in the kind of exposure I had. But then went to school in Chicago and went to nursing school in Oak Park, Illinois. Actually, it's on the west side of Chicago. And it's a school affiliated with Loyola University. And we got our credits, and many of our professors were from the university that came out to teach us during the program. And I was there from 39 to 42. And what else?
So what was your degree?
Nursing.
Nursing, so
it was an RN degree. It was an RN degree. But it was actually given to us by Loyola University, and the credits were applicable to getting a BS. But at that time, most of the nurses were still RNs. And now, of course, all the programs are, I think, pretty much geared to the BSN program, and I don't instead.
So you say you finished in 1942? Is that correct?
Graduated from nursing school 43, actually.
In 43?
Yeah, 39 to 43.
So what happened next?
Well, it was during the war, and many of my classmates opted to go into the service, and because everybody was very conscious of doing something and wanted to do something to really support the war effort, and it was a very difficult time for a lot of people, and many of my classmates did. I had planned to probably do that, when surprisingly I got a call one day from a former professor of mine who was in nursing school, and she no longer was at the school, but she was working at another hospital. She was working actually at a university. And she called me and said she had something to talk to me about. Would I be interested? We'd just become very good friends as well. And so I had lunch with her, and she had been hired as the recruiter for nurses for the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I don't know if she was recruiting nurses for all of the other Manhattan Project medical facilities as well. And so I had just been a graduate for a few months, and She said she thought it would be a wonderful opportunity. And I said, well, I was thinking about going into the service. She said, oh, you'll be making a wonderful contribution to the war effort by serving in this ultra-secret, wonderful project. And thought that I should certainly seriously consider doing that, and that I could have the job of being director of the emergency room, or head nurse, I should say, not the director. I didn't do any of the hiring. So I was a head nurse for the emergency room, if I was interested. So I thought, well, I guess I think I'll try it, because if I don't like it, I can at least quit. In the service, you're stuck. But at any rate, I did. And I loved it and loved every minute of it. And so I said, yes, I agreed to do that. And I actually went to Oak Ridge on August the 15th, 1943. I told you, by the way, I just remember I graduated in 42. And I went to Oak Ridge in 43. So I'm sorry about that. So that was, I went on a train from Chicago, took a sleeper train. I did know one person who was already in Oak Ridge. She too had been a classmate of mine, and she came to the train in Oak Ridge with a friend to pick me up. And we went out to Oak Ridge, and at that time, the living quarters in the town were 2 dormitories for women, and I think 1 or 2 for men, and a big cafeteria. That's all that was built at that time. They were in the process, of course, of developing this huge city, which eventually had 75,000 people. But most of the people who are currently working, and all 3 sites, K25, Y12, and X10, had already been established, and they are each about 10 miles out from the town of Oak Ridge. But the workers who were there were living in Knoxville primarily. You know, the scientists and so forth. There wasn't enough housing in the town of Oak Ridge yet. It was being developed and being built, and of course not nearly enough people had been recruited. And so at that time, and it was a big project. But over a period of, I'd say, a year or 2, they just, can't remember the exact length of time, but the town, for the workers, they were able to bring their families and come to Oak Ridge and work out at these sites. But when they went to work, they went by bus from the town center. Buses went out to either X10, Y12, or K25, which were the sites, of course. And it was very much emphasized to all of us as we were getting indoctrinated into our jobs and the place, how important this project was, how secret it was, how important it was that we make sure that we not discuss what we did with even co-workers and so forth, to try just be very aware. And of course there were big gates and fences around the whole area, and you couldn't, to get in and out of the project, no one could pay you a surprise visit. You had to be authorized get permission to have someone come visit you, and make arrangements for someone to meet them at the gate if you had indeed a visitor. Well, all my friends and relatives were up in the Midwest. I didn't have any visitors, at least in the beginning. And it was just a very exciting time. All of us that lived in the dorm were all young and all from somewhere else. New York, California, Midwest, Chicago, and so we got to meet a lot of different people right instantly. And of course, the only place to eat was this big cafeteria, which was just close to the dorms. And you had no choice. There were no Burger Kings or anything. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and of course, no one had cars, or very few had cars, but there was bus transportation into Knoxville for people who wanted to go in to do shopping or go to another restaurant or something. But Oak Ridge did a good job of trying to keep young people happy, and I think the average age group was like 27 or 28. It was a very young group, probably and a lot were a lot younger than that, and most lived in dormitories in the beginning. But they did a lot to try to have activities. They had a recreation center, they got music, they got theaters, they had an orchestra, tennis courts, and, organized ball games and teams to try to figure out activities for people to do. I think we did a very good job of it, really. So we didn't lack for things to do, but most people in the beginning met at the rec center evenings, which was one big recreation center, right near the cafeteria, and then went back to dorms. And eventually people were able to, I was in a dorm until the nursing home. The hospital was not built. It was in the process of being built. And I think I was the 8th nurse from some of them were from Minnesota and New York. The 8th person was part of the staff. And we worked out of what was kind of like a warehouse as a first aid station in the beginning, along with about 4 or 5 doctors. And we just would see people who had minor injuries. If anything serious or a hospital was needed, they went to Knoxville. But that's how we started until the hospital was completed, which was in December. I got there in August. And then at the time that the hospital was finished, the nursing home, meaning not a nursing home like takes care of people, but for the nurses to live in, was built right next to the hospital. So I was able to move along with other nurses to the nursing home, and then we had our own room, and we shared a bath with one other nurse, so it was much nicer and closer. Well, the other wasn't that far, but much better than a dorm, because the dorms just had, showers at the end of the hall, and you shared a room with someone else, and it was just like college dorms. But in spite of all what seemed like not very good living, everybody seemed happy and seemed to have a good time, and there was met a lot of wonderful people. Stayed friends with many of them for my whole life. In fact, we still have friends who live in Oak Ridge. Not many left. They have to be in my age group, which is, when you have to be 93, there are not too many of your friends around anymore.
Tell us about the hospital. So how many beds did it have?
It started to be a 50-bed hospital. Why? Someone decided that figure was going to be adequate, but before it was even started, they knew that they immediately said, well, it'd be at least 200. So I think that's about where it ended. And that was the size of the hospital. And of course, it was just a regular hospital with the various departments. And we had doctors from all over the country who staffed it. All the doctors there were military. They were not, they came from private practice. And they came, as I said, a lot of them were from the University of Minnesota and the University of Chicago. As the town grew, in the emergency room was an especially busy place because there were no doctor's offices anywhere else. So as these houses were being built and families were moving in, if they needed medical service of any kind, they had to come to the hospital. But within months, they started to build an outpatient department and staff it with all the specialty doctors that you'd find in a normal city situation, OBs, GYN, ENTs, pediatrics. And that building was built next door to the hospital. And doctors from those specialties came to staff that clinic area. So I kind of grew with the job, and instead of just being in the emergency room, I developed into being in charge of the nursing department in the outpatient department. And we had nurses in all of the clinics. And I didn't recruit or hire any of the personnel, but kind of helped set up the clinics and helped develop protocol and standing orders and things of that nature for setting up clinics. And then just as I said, I think we saw close to 1,000 patients a day at one time. This is from all of the clinics. That's how big and how fast the place grew.
So how many nurses?
Oh, there were quite a few. We had at least 2 or 3 in each clinic. OB, I think, had 4 or 5, because we had 3 OB doctors, and they all had and of course, as I said, it was a very young population, and a lot of young families moved in. But the hospital itself was, I think, eventually it was about 200 people. I don't know. So whatever it takes to staff a hospital of that size. We had a wonderful director of nurses. I don't know if you know of anybody. Isabel Weber was our nursing director. And it was just pretty much, and it was operated for the workers of the people who worked in the plants. We didn't work with any radiation or radiation exposure or anything at that hospital. Now, each of the plants, the 3 I mentioned, had their own dispensary as well. And they saw patients 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, because it operated on that. And where people could go if they were sick, or if there was an incident like radiation or radiation exposure, which occasionally would happen in spite of all the many precautions that they take to avoid that kind of thing. And there were certain procedures that had to be followed for decontamination, and that would be done out in those areas rather than not at the hospital. The hospital was primarily for the families of the people, of the workers in the town.
So can you describe the decontamination procedures? What would they do?
I really am not familiar with it. I just remember that there were lots of showers, and nothing was ever a serious exposure in Oak Ridge that I'm aware of, nor did I ever hear. I know they had an incident or two in, I think, Los Alamos and so forth, where people were overexposed from working at the labs and ultimately died, or probably some suffered consequences years later, which we're not still aware of, or which we weren't for a long time aware of. But for the most part, the procedure involved, I remember they couldn't maybe go home that night if it happened during the day. Everybody wore a badge that had counted the amount of radiation at any of the lab sites. You didn't wear this badge in the town of Oak Ridge, but if you went out to X10, Y12, or K25, you wore a badge, and it was monitored and by Geiger counters, and it was determined if you were getting too much exposure, and if it met a certain amount of time, I don't know what the rate was, but they would have to report to a place for decontamination. And I just remember that they underwent showers and probably had to spend the night and were closely monitored. But the type of radiation was mostly on the outside. This was not the kind that would be, the gamma, I think, or the really serious kind, or like with the people who were working directly in the labs, the doctors. The scientists that worked at the labs, but the average worker would not have had exposure to serious radiation. They had done a tremendous job, I've been told, and as I guess we all know, from having any serious problems with contamination. And they did a lot to people wore coats and Geiger counters, and I don't know, that's about it. I worked at the lab, and everybody who worked there, even though you didn't work directly on any of the experiments or anything, you still wore that little meter if you worked in the area. I know people think that that was really dangerous, but I don't think at any time it was really dangerous. They did a lot of wonderful things to keep that from happening, to protect people, and apparently did a good job of it.
Excuse me. You mentioned that everything was very secret there.
Well, yes, and they led us to believe that it really, really was, and we shouldn't discuss what we do at work. Well, that didn't apply as much to people like me. When you're just working in a hospital setting, most of the information and the people I talked with were about their conditions, and it was like any other hospital, really. But I'm sure people who went out to the various labs were doing things very unique and different, and it was really applicable to people like that to make sure that they didn't discuss something that could have become something that would have developed into a more serious problem.
So you had, obviously the group of nurses that you got to know well, that you worked with, but you also had friends that actually did work on the project. And how did you meet them? And
I met them primarily through the social status that was arranged through our church. I happen to be Catholic, and we had a very active and wonderful priest who was assigned to that parish. They set up St. Mary's Parish, and his house became an open house every Sunday for all the Catholics, young people who were there. And a big group of us met. I'd say probably 15 to 20 people about every Sunday. That was one place where you got me. The recreation center was open on a nightly basis with music, and those were primarily, and then just by working with people, you made friends. And of course, Norris Dam and Norris Park was not very far away. Not a lot of people had cars, but those that did, we had a lot of picnics in those areas. Beautiful. And of course, Smoky Mountains is only about 25 or 30 miles away. And as people moved in and people had cars, we got to know people who did. And there were ways by bus to go for a weekend up to Gatlinburg, which was about 40 miles away. But in the town, there were not a lot of, just except for theater. They also had developed a little theater group, and a lot of people became active in that. And dancing, music, and that was primarily the extent of the activity. But went into Knoxville to games. University of Tennessee was there, for football games.
do you think that you had more freedom than, let's say, Colleen Black, your friend who was working on the leak detection?
No,
No.
I do not think I had him. She happened to be working with something that was needed to be guarded. In my case, I hardly was not working with anyone directly. I did have the little incidents about working at the apartment that I lived in. I guess, did I tell you that story?
You should tell it to us.
Okay. Well, I lived in the nursing home like all the nurses did when we first got there. Things continued to grow, and eventually we outgrew the nursing home. So the Colonel Ray added an apartment building. Now, when I'm talking about apartment building, it just was a unit that had 4 apartments, 2 for 2 people each, and the center ones were for 4 people, and arranged to rent this apartment or get this apartment building right next to the hospital. And I was one of the nurses offered an opportunity to get out of the nursing home and move to an apartment. So I agreed to do that, and my roommate was the chief dietitian of the hospital. And so we had our own apartment, which was a step up from having your own room, which was really very nice. It was right next to the hospital as well. Well, I was there for about a year, I guess. And Colonel Ray called me one day and said, "Rosemary, I have to take your apartment away." And he said, "I hate to do you. You'll have to move back to the nursing home, at least for the time being, until we can find if there's another opening." And they needed to use my apartment because I was an officer in the Navy, I believe, who was working out at XY12. One of the centers had become mentally deranged, and he was going to have to be hospitalized. And because he worked so directly with such important things, they didn't feel that it was safe to move him to any hospital off the area because of what he knew, and he had so much valuable secretive information that they decided he would have to stay on the premises. So they fixed up my apartment, barred the windows, and had a guard and a full-time caretaker for him. And of course, he was right next to the hospital, and he was getting shock therapy treatments as well. He was being treated for his mental condition at the place. So that's how I lost my apartment. And I never did, never did go back to that apartment. But that was, and he had to be kept there. It was determined that he would have to stay in Oak Ridge until the war was over, that he could not be ever transferred to any other facility for treatment because it would not be safe.
No, I think that you were asked by, let's see, there was someone else. Was this that you were assisting Dr. Eric Kent
I did.
Clark?
I helped him do shock therapy treatments on this patient.
Why don't you tell us who this person is? I mean, that he was the chief psychiatrist.
Yes,
right?
yeah. Eric Clark was the head of the whole psychiatric department at the Oak Ridge Hospital. Now, we didn't have a big psych unit for any other patients, but he was available, and he was available and for a lot of visits, and he did have a few patients, but we weren't set up to have a psychiatric unit at the hospital. But he counseled lots of groups, and he had his own big clinic with a lot of helpers. Well, I shouldn't say a lot. I think there were really only 2 other psychiatrists that were there at the time. But he was quite well known in his profession, and
so
nice guy to work with.
Was he kind of an afterthought? I mean, in that, did you come first and they built the hospital and then they said, we need
Yes.
to bring, all right, tell us that.
The original hospital staff did not include a psychiatrist. I can't remember exactly at what point that was added, but it was quite a few months later. I wouldn't say years, but maybe months later. We just started with the basic people that are at an average hospital first, but psychiatry was not one of them. But the need soon developed that there was very much of a need for psychiatric services, not only for the workers there, but for the families of workers. And, there was just a lot of pressure and tension for everyone, I think, during the war. Everybody was away from home. Everybody was living under different circumstances. And I personally didn't have any contact with someone who needed to seek psychiatric services, but overall, throughout the whole plant area, I understand it became, very necessary to have someone there in that department to take care of their needs.
I have a note here, probably from Denise's book, that you had assisted him, that is Dr. Clark, in an electric shock treatment procedure for a man who wanted to go to Japan. Do you remember
Yeah, well,
this?
that was the man I talked about, the one that I had to. He's the one that was put into my apartment building.
Right, and tell us.
But I did not know the man other than to see him as a patient.
I see. Tell us what was his purpose. He wanted to go to Japan.
I don't really know the details, except that was one of the things. He had so much knowledge, and his plan was to really do something destructive, and that they felt it just not safe to even consider having him being treated anywhere away from Oak Ridge because of what he knew or what information he could convey that could affect the whole safety of the United States. Yeah, he was one of the.
Was it after the war or during the war they had? Were you involved in Eb Cade's situation, the African American who was in an automobile accident? I guess that was March of '45.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
That was March of '45. That was the year that the war ended, August of 45.
Right, but it was
Yeah,
before
this happened
that,
before
so it
that,
was-
right?
Yeah.
I'm not was not familiar with that case as it was developing in Oak Ridge at all. I only really found out about it after it was over. It was really I know they did have him in the hospital in Oak Ridge. They did add a part to the hospital that was to do some experimental work with radiation. And Dr. Dwight Clark was very active in that department. He was one of the surgeons on the staff. But that unit was added onto the hospital, and the regular hospital staff were not the ones that supplied the services for that. They had their own little section. You had a big metal door to go through to go onto that wing of the hospital. And it was staffed by a different group who were just working with some of the research. And I'm not familiar with, even those of us who worked there were not aware that this was really, we knew that there was some experimental going on, work going on, but did not know what it was. And it was strictly, it was within that department. And that man was treated, of course, in that department, who had those multiple fractures, which, if you read the book, you know, but I did not know the man, or was I aware of the problem when it was developing. He had multiple fractures as a result of an accident, and they were, it was some type of radiation procedure that this doctor felt would be helpful in healing these fractures. And so he was the one who was in charge of in developing this program. I do not know what the real outcome was. He had to go back. He did have problems with, I guess, they followed him for quite a long time after he got out of his acute situation at the hospital when they healed, and they kept following him. But then they lost track of him for a couple of years somehow or other. But I understand that he did eventually live to be 60-some years old. He didn't die early from radiation exposure, which was a consideration at the time when you exposed people to radiation. How satisfactory the experiment was, or if it worked, or if it was something that they ever used again, I do not know.
Let's see, or a patient that you ran across was General Groves.
Oh, yes, just for a very short time. But I did meet General Groves, and I actually helped and did physical therapy for him one day, which was simple. I mean, not the real physical therapy by using hands-on and massage, but it was just applying like some kind of a heat lamp. I'm trying to think, had a specific name, because he had a bad shoulder. He'd been traveling a lot, and this was like 6:45 in the morning, or it was right, or about 7:45, I guess. And the director of the hospital just came into my office and said, "Rosemary, I'd like you to do it." Certainly wasn't anything I needed any specific knowledge to attach him to, but I did visit with him for a short time. He was a very pleasant man, just big and kind of gruff looking, but very pleasant for about a half hour. So I stayed right there with him while he was getting this treatment. And so was Colonel Ray. I mean, I wasn't the only one there in the room with him. So I did get to meet the general.
Well, you have the sense that he was such a man with so much drive.
He was.
Was he restless, saying, "Whoa, are you done yet?"
No, not at all. Very gentle, I have to say, very gentle. He certainly gave the appearance of being very big, gruff and big, and I guess probably to some of the people he might have worked with, but he certainly wasn't on a one-to-one basis, or at least the opportunity I had meeting him. Yeah, that was kind of not scary, but you just think, oh my gosh, hope nothing goes wrong. But there wasn't much chance that would happen, and it didn't. And I guess he got better. I guess his shoulder got better. He continued to run the show quite well for a lot of years.
He did indeed. All right. Now you talked about when you were growing up in Holy Cross, Iowa. It was very homogeneous society. So when you came to Oak Ridge, and of course you'd been to Chicago, but do you have any memories, or can you describe what it was like in Oak Ridge, where they had sort of a Southern culture and segregation was the mode, I guess? Would you?
Yes, it was. Of course, I got some of that in Chicago, but that's not like the South. I mean, there was, we had segregation to some degree, and they didn't schools and so forth like that were, but of course, in the South it was totally different, and the bathrooms and the eating places and all so segregated, and they truly were. It was, and I remember being so impressed with what was the name of the area in Oak Ridge?
Scarborough?
Scarborough area, where just the black people lived. And it bothers me in my own mind that I wasn't more distressed by what I saw, and not that I could have as an individual done anything about it, but I just accepted, along with all these other people, that it was okay for those people to live like that, and they seemed happy, because what I'm referring to now are the workers, and these were not technical people. For the most part, all the black people, at least, I don't know that I met anybody that was a technical person or some, a highly educated person. They were there mostly to do the custodial services wherever they were needed. Very pleasant, a lot of very nice people. But they were segregated and lived in the area called Scarborough. They could not bring their children to live with them. Those people, husbands and wife, could come and they could live together. They had units for them, but they had to leave their children in Alabama or Mississippi or somewhere else, because there were no services where they didn't have for schools, and nor was there space. And these people would go home weekends or whenever they were off. They worked 7 and see their children, but seemed to be just, it was okay. They had good jobs. They made lots of money, much more than they'd ever made anyplace else. So the black people themselves just seemed to be very content with life as it was. At least they didn't convey any different feelings at any time when I was in their presence, or nor did I hear of it from anyone else who was also exposed to those people while we were living there.
So you mentioned that we're not schools for young black children. How about for the young white children?
Oh yeah, we had schools, wonderful schools. It's a wonderful school system. They developed schools just like in any other city. Very good school system. And Knoxville they had schools for black people, for black children in Knoxville, and which is a pretty good sized city, several of them. Clinton was about 7 miles away, and there was a school for black children in Clinton. So, and some of the black people who worked there, as were some of the whites, not everybody lived in Oak Ridge. By far majority did, but they lived in surrounding areas and commuted to work or to their jobs. Yeah, like black people into the town or out to the sites where the labs were. But they didn't all live in the town of Oak Ridge. Kingston, and some community even farther than that. But
were there buses then that would go out to
yeah, everybody,
pick these people up?
The workers would, lots of buses, because I don't think anybody drove from the town out. There were no parking places for them. You got on a bus. You caught a bus at a site in the town of Oak Ridge, and it was about a 10-mile drive, I think, to each of the plants. There were 3 different sites, and I think each of them were about 10 miles from the center of town. And they would just take public transportation. I used to, on occasion, babysit for Major Ryan's children. They had 2 little girls, 7 and 9, and they were so wonderful to me. I spent the first Christmas, I think it was, with their house, but they were so good to, and anyway, on occasion I would babysit, and I was babysitting at their house one night, and they got home about 11 o'clock, or I can't remember the time. But he was called home because it was this train wreck in Jellicoe, and it was a troop train that had derailed in Jellicoe, which I think was probably, within 20 miles of Oak Ridge? I don't remember the exact distance, but Oak Ridge was the nearest hospital. So they brought the many injured and some dead soldiers to Oak Ridge Hospital. And Colonel Ray came, when he came back to the house, he said, "Rosemary, you need probably to go back to work because everybody who can possibly come to the hospital, nurses included, all, came because all these people were being brought in by ambulances and I guess mostly whatever, any other way, the trucks or whatever, to the hospital." So I did went back down. And it was a very busy place. We had cots lined up in all the hallways of the hospital because the injuries were, I think, in the hundreds. I'm not just sure that they had people at the number, but it was a lot of them. There was a lot of excitement, and it was very sad, but it did happen. It just derailed, and I don't know that it was ever anybody's fault. It was just an accident. But I know there was question at the time, was it something intentional, by some, but that never did develop into anything other than just an accident. So, that was an exciting couple of days, because within days, and those who needed continued hospitalization were taken to Knoxville, and I think Kingston had a small hospital, or I don't remember, but they couldn't accommodate everybody. But for the emergency treatment, they all came. Their first go-around was at the Oak Ridge Hospital. And so I think it happened in the middle of the night, so it was early in the morning. The day the bomb was stopped. It's the day that we found out that what actually was going on. But prior to that, everyone knew we were doing some big secret project, but nobody knew. But like Denise mentions in the book, a lot of people were also concerned because they saw all these trains coming in all the time, bringing, I guess, uranium ore and so forth to process it. But nothing was ever going out. There were no big machines, no nothing. We were supposed to be developing something special. Nobody could really figure it out. So it was really, but none of us, we all just knew it was something supposedly. Well, the morning that, it was the day after the bomb was dropped, when Colonel Ray came by my office and all the other doctors who were in their offices on the same wing, come to my office by 10 o'clock in the morning. There's going to be a very special, important announcement. I think 10 o'clock was the time. It might have been 11. And so we all did. We met there, and it was President Truman, and it was when he announced that the bomb had been dropped the day before. They actually didn't tell people till the next day or hours after it had happened. And here we were. It was such I still remember, such a shock to think it was something, so they talked about this big mushroom cloud and that there were a lot of casualties, and nobody really knew the totals for days later of how awful the destruction was. But that was how I found out, as did everybody in that room. He said, "Now you know what you've been doing here." He just made that statement. This is what has been going on here for these last couple of years, and to developing, and the processing for the bomb that was used and was dropped was done in Oak Ridge. The uranium ore that was used in that bomb was processed at one of the plants there. So it was a feeling of relief in many ways. The war was over. A lot of us I had a brother who was in the service, lots of people, and we all knew how awful, how hard it was to, have the war continue to go on and on and on with so many people dying. But so it was relief in a way, and then of course you couldn't help but feel sadness in all the people, especially when women and children were involved. You felt, was it really necessary? But in my own mind, I was never felt that it was not justified by feeling I felt that we did what had to be done at the time, meaning that, Japan had been warned and they continued, before we actually dropped it. And so although it was sad and you hated to see it have to be necessary, but I never questioned the fact that it should not have been used. We had already lost so many people and would have lost many more had something not been done. So I know that's been a controversial topic for a lot of people. For years later, were we justified in doing something so drastic? Good.
Now it's been nearly 70 years, it will be 70 years next summer, since that bomb was dropped and you first heard it, and
I know.
How would you say you felt? Have you been pretty consistent then for the last 70 years, even though it's come up, time to time as you say, a controversial issue?
You mean in changing my mind about the problem?
Yeah, or have different
Not
insight?
for me. It just never was. It just, from what I know about it, I felt we had warned them, that this was it was going to be devastating. And so it wasn't that's, I guess, how I justified it, especially the women and children part. That's the part but I felt we had lost so many lives, and it was so terrible, and I knew so many people. I mean, my brother came back safe and sound. He had a terrible experience. I mean, he had a lot of unfortunate experiences, but he came back and he was relatively healthy and lived a normal life, but so many didn't. And I knew a lot of those people, friends and relatives, that were part of a family that lost people. I mean, had lost members of their family. And I just felt it was okay. And actually, I think that was pretty much the general opinion of all the people that I worked with, the immediate reaction. That it was going to end the war, which had been so bad for so many years on two fronts. It's really, just before I went into, I graduated from, I'll backtrack a little bit. I was graduated in June of '42, and then I took a night job because I did some graduate work at Loyola University, so I took this job in a plant in Chicago area, the West Side, that used to make kitchen hardware, kitchen pots and pans and things like that, and that factory was converted to a factory that made 20 and 40 millimeter shells for the war effort. So they quit making all this kitchen equipment for that. As Detroit quit making cars and made trucks and Jeeps, heavy stuff. And that's what a lot of the factories I did. I remember doing that, and I thought that was my first introduction on how the war was changing people's lives, and lots of women came to work even at night at that factory, helping make 20 and 40 millimeter shells, because the factory used to just operate 5 days a week, 9 to 5, and of course, when we were involved with the war, they stayed open, as did many factories do similar things. So everybody was very, very tired of war by the time we'd had it and lost a lot of people. Rationing, things like that, which didn't affect me very much directly, but it was just, but people, I think, were so patriotic. I just feel that nobody wanted to go to war. Nobody thought, but no one ever protested or felt like we shouldn't be there or we shouldn't be doing that. And it was just a feeling. It was just a job that had to be done. And I don't know, but I think that it was a nice feeling in a way to see people so connected and so all really fighting for the same cause. And I don't know what would happen in this day and age if we ever got involved like that again. I don't know. I'd hate to think of. Hopefully it'll never, ever, ever, ever happen again.
So how did this whole experience change you as you're thinking about your life? How would your life have been different, if it would have been different or the same, had it not been for the war intervening just at that time you were coming of age?
Well, I probably wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have these children because I met and married my husband in Oak Ridge, so met him there. That was so who knows, that would have changed. As far as my career, nursing was what I wanted to do, and I did pursue it for the rest of that time. But it was interesting. So my husband had been in the service for 4 years in the Navy. He had been at school at Creighton University, and then when he was going to be drafted, he opted to join the Navy because that was his preference in the service. And so this is after serving, he came back, and he was looking for a job. He was also going to go back to school because he didn't finish his school. So he came to visit a friend in Oak Ridge who was stationed there in the military. And his friend said, well, why don't you, they're hiring major was biology and chemistry. And he said, well, the lab is looking for some people to work. Maybe you could get a job down here. And so he'd gotten out of the service in November, I think, and this was in January. And so he interviewed for the job, and he got a job there. And so he got a job in Oak Ridge, and I happened to meet him in Oak Ridge because it was in the same building that the medical department was. And I was in the nursing, and he was in the research part of it, and he needed to borrow some material one day for some suturing he was doing on animals that they were exposing to radiation and so forth. So he came to the health department, and I, of course, let him have some suture material, catgut material, and he just asked me where I was from, and I said, oh, I was from a little town in Iowa. And he said, well, where is it from? I said, near Dubuque. And he said, tell me the name of it. And I said, well, you'd never heard of it. It's Holy Cross. He said, well, I used to play baseball in Holy Cross. He was from Cascade, Iowa, 15 miles away. And we'd grown up the same age group all those years and never had met down there. So you see that, but after you meet the person you're going to spend the rest of your life with, and I did spend almost the rest of it. He just passed away a couple of months ago. But so things would have been, who knows what my life would have been like. I wouldn't have been in Oak Ridge, and probably would never have met him, and probably stayed in the Chicago area because that's probably what I would have done. So, like for a lot of people, it changed a lot of people's lives. So.
You also remarked about how many women were employed both in the factory in Chicago, getting ready for the war effort, and of course in Oak Ridge, a lot of women were working there. How if you kept up with any of them, do you see how it changed their lives?
Oh yeah. See, nurses would be working anywhere. So if you're going to be a nurse, I mean, my work was pretty much determined. But a lot of these other girls had jobs that they never dreamed they would work and do things like the girls in Oak Ridge did, or like in the factory who made, they were jobs totally that women were never involved with. So you can see where it made. For my particular life, I'd have probably always been a nurse in a hospital somewhere. But for many people, it brought women out who never had worked before, who had never earned money before on their own. Most of my associates were with with nurses. When you work with nurses, most of your friends were in kind of the same category. But many wonderful friends still in Oak Ridge who came there from other parts of the country just to get a job with the government, and who had never worked before in any government installation and probably never would have. And so it was a great experience.
And those friends who stayed on in Oak Ridge kept working on?
Oh, yeah, and most of them married. You know, most of us were very young, and I told you what the average age was, and there were lots of couples, very good friends of ours, who met in Oak Ridge and married in Oak Ridge, and some of them are still in Oak Ridge. You know, they never left. An awful lot of them didn't move, move out and come back. Like when my husband was transferred back up here, the whole unit that was with the Atomic Energy Commission was all sent up here to Washington. So it just became a smaller place, but it always has remained a very vital, and I think a very nice, and those people who still live there love it. And one of the hardest things I ever had to do in my life was move from Oak Ridge, because we had 4 young children and lots of good friends, and we loved it. But we did, and we've been very happy up here. Met a lot of other nice, very nice people. You know, life goes on.
Okay.
Bowling was a big thing that was one of our recreations. They had a lot of bowling alleys, and bowling was a popular sport at the time, a lot of leagues, and so that was our recreation. And I did happen to be pretty good at bowling.
Oh, that's terrific.
And at one time rolled 269, and this is in a 10-pin setting, and that was the highest score ever bowled by a woman in the state of Tennessee at the time. So that's my claim to fame. Yeah, there was a lot of bowling and a lot of bowling leagues. That was a big form of recreation down there.
Yeah.
A lot of softball teams. I never played softball, but women and men's teams and baseball teams. And they were all young people. I mean, the parents as well as the kids. So you had a lot of, it wasn't, there just never were any old people in Oak Ridge for a lot of years after we got there. They didn't even have a funeral home for many, many years. Because they just didn't have people just didn't die.
Yes,
I mean, they were in their 20s, 30s, had young families, so it took a few years to develop into a city that would have normal age range of people, from oldsters to youngsters.